Welcome to the Institute for New Economic Thinking. We're here today with a very special friend. He is a professor of economics at Columbia and a Nobel laureate. He is the one and only Joseph Stiglitz. Good to have you here with us today, Joe.
Nice to be here.
Well, the topic of inequality is certainly a hot one this year, and I wanted to ask you something. I'm going to put the field of economics on the spot, if I could. What I wanted to ask you as an economist is, to what degree has bad economic theory contributed to the problem of inequality?
I do think that economists share some of the blame for the increase in inequality, just like they share some of the blame, I think, for the great crisis of 2008. It was the economic models at that time that said markets were self-adjusting, the system was stable, we could deregulate, rely on self-regulation, and the system would work well. We now know that was wrong. But ideas, economic ideas, played a very big role in reinforcing some self-interest, moving us in that direction of self-regulation, deregulation. In the case of inequality, it's a little bit different. There were a couple of ideas in economics that I think were particularly, maybe say, invidious, unhelpful.
Okay.
One of them was that a very deep idea called the second welfare theorem of welfare economics.
That's a mouthful.
And it's a mouthful, but the idea was a very simple one, that the economist should focus on making the size of the economic pie as big as possible, and then leave it to the political process to decide on how that pie is divided. So distribution, which was a question of how the pie got divided, was something for some other areas, but economics was interested in only one area, making the pie as big as possible.
Okay.
The second theorem, welfare economics, is said effectively that you could separate out those two ideas, separate distribution from efficiency, that you could achieve any distribution that you wanted through a market or market-friendly process.
Hasn't worked out that way.
Hasn't worked out that way. It got so bad that one Nobel Prize winner said, actually, the most dangerous subject for economists to talk about was distribution. He said it was actually dangerous. Why? Because he said in worrying about how you divided the pie, you would lose attention on how to make the pie bigger, and the only way to enrich everybody was to make the pie bigger. And that was related to a third idea that was very, very popular at one time. No theory behind it, no evidence behind it, but that was a theory of trickle-down economics. And that was a very strongly held view. President Kennedy shared in that view. Rising tide lifts all boats. Make the economy bigger, everybody will benefit. So it was not only that a larger pie could benefit everybody, but a larger pie would benefit
It's quite a leap.
everybody. And that big leap between those words, could and would.
Yes.
And we now have the evidence. In the United States, our pie has been getting bigger and bigger almost every year except 2008-9, the time of the crisis.
And the yachts are getting bigger and bigger.
The yachts are getting even bigger, but the little small boats are being crashed on the shores. The median income, people in the middle, have had their income go down year after year. Median income today is lower than it was 25 years ago. Median income of a full-time male worker is lower than it was 40 years ago. Wages at the bottom are lower than they were half a century ago. So in my mind, an economic system that doesn't deliver, doesn't raise standards of living for most Americans is a failed economic system. And in those terms, ours is a failed economic system. And this is where I do blame the economists, because they thought, just get that pie bigger, just get GDP going, and the system would work for most Americans. Not true.
Right. Now we see that that's not the case. Economists are now puzzling over this problem of inequality, which is a good thing. But there's some disagreement about what the causes might be. And you have an interesting idea that I know you have talked about in a recent paper, that land and real estate has really played a pivotal role in creating the situation we have. Can you explain a little bit about how that has worked, how it's happened?
Well, the big disagreement, this is more of a technical dispute, but an important one for policy purposes, among economists, all of whom agree that inequality is a big issue. But once you recognize that inequality is a big issue, you want to dig deeper what's causing it and what can we do about it. So there is one school of thought, highlighted by the work of Piketty, for instance, that it's capital in the 21st century. That with the rate of return on capital greater than the rate of growth of the economy, capital is going to grow faster. Those who have capital, reinvesting, and therefore their wealth is growing and growing and growing, and at the expense of the rest.
Something tells me you don't think that's the whole story.
And there's a grain of truth in that, but the point is that's not the big story.
Okay.
You look at savings, okay, old theory, 19th century, famous economist, Nassau Senior, who was actually a professor at Oxford, held the chair that I held at Oxford, it was the first chair in economics, came up with this idea called abstinence theory. So his theory was that...
Sounds like it belongs in another field, but...
So his theory was that the reason that the rich are rich is because they've sacrificed. So they've sacrificed by not consuming, that's abstinence, and that's what makes them wealthier and wealthier. So all that the rich were getting was a reward for their hard work, their not consuming, being prudent, frugal. So that's the kind of idea that you say, good thing, we ought to be rewarding them.
Sure.
You look at the details of what's happened in America.
The frugality is hard to see.
The frugality is hard to see. You look at the savings rate of the economy, and you cannot account for the increase in the wealth that has occurred.
So where's it coming from?
And what you see increasingly is that the wealth has come from especially capital gains on land. But when you look at it more deeply, it's not just capital gains on land. Land generates rents, not from work. You just own the piece of land and you take in money.
Right.
But also those people who own oil or other natural resources, they're not getting the return to hard work. They're just getting the return to their ownership claim in these resources, which are God's gift to the world. But then you start looking even deeper and you realize that a lot of the rents are what we call exploitation rents, rents associated with monopoly power, with discrimination, with taking advantage of your, say, power in the corporation to seize for the CEOs a larger and larger share of the corporate pie. There are all these kinds of rents in the system that don't make the economy more efficient. They actually make the economy less efficient. But when you capitalize the rents, you turn the rents into an asset. So you have a monopoly. Monopoly generates what we call monopoly rents. You can call it monopoly profits. But once I get that, I can buy and sell it. Microsoft gets a monopoly in the operating system, generates huge profits, but then those get bought and sold. And the person who originally owns them becomes very wealthy. We know that's the wealthiest person in the world.
So this is helping the rich get richer.
Very, very much so. In fact, if you look at the Forbes 100, a lot of the people at that top are not from saving and saving and saving, it's from monopoly rents. But another example, the banks. Among the people at the top are the bankers and the owners of the banks. Okay, now, if you deregulate, if you change the rules of the game so that the bankers get bailed out by the public, they make more and more money, but who's really paying for it? Ordinary citizens through the taxes. Now, the value of those bailout rents, as we call them, are capitalized in the value of the shares of the banks, especially before the crisis. But the other side, the fact that we, the taxpayers, are bearing the burden, that negative wealth is not showing up on our accounts. It should, but it's not. So a lot of the increase in wealth is not real wealth. Or to put it even in terms of land, here in France, the value of the Riviera has gone way up as the Russian oligarchs and others are all want these, what we call positional goods. But the fact that the value of the land in Riviera is up doesn't mean that France is more productive.
Right.
It's the same amount of land. And what is really dangerous is that while all the money is going into these fixed assets, less is going into productive capital. And the result of that is the economy is actually potentially less productive. The most important source of rents, in a way, from a distribution point of view for what's going on in the growing inequality, is evidenced by the following. In the last 40 years, productivity of American workers, if you exclude the top 1% who are not workers, who are people with bankers and CEOs and things like that.
They're not job creators?
They're not, yeah. If you look at the productivity of the real American workers, it's doubled.
And the wages, on the other
have
hand,
stagnated.
Right.
So a gap has opened up, and you have to explain that. That, in my mind, is what I call rents, exploitation. It's taking advantage. It's the rules of the game. And this is really the point. It's not about capitalism in the 21st century. It's the way we've changed the rules of the game to disadvantage ordinary people.
Well, that sort of leads me to my next question, which is, what do we have to lose if we don't confront this problem? And one of the things you're pointing to that we would lose, I think, is the sense that hard work can get you far in life. If you're an ordinary person, you might do better than your parents did before you. You'll have a dignified life, a dignified retirement. You'll be able to send your kids to a good school. What happens to us and what's at stake if we don't confront this?
One of the ways of thinking about this is back in what we now realize golden age of capitalism, which wasn't so golden because there was discrimination, there was inequality, even
What
then.
years are we talking about?
We're talking about 50 to 80, say,
Right.
45 to 80.
And if you were a woman or a person of color, it probably looked even less exciting.
Exactly. So in this period, though, we had a conception of a middle-class society. We had a conception, if you played by the rules, you worked hard, you were going to move up, you were going to be better than your parents, your children were going to be better off than you. We were getting a sense of security. All of that's gone. Now, the children are less well off than their parents. We're no longer a land of opportunity. In fact, when we look at the data, we now realize that a young American's prospects are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in other advanced countries. We are the least consistent with the American dream. France is more of an American dream than America.
Interesting.
So this is really undermining our self-conception, others' conception of us,
Our identity.
and I believe it's destroying our society. And then there's another element that I really emphasize both in my book, The Price of Inequality, and my new book, The Great Divide, that it's actually undermining our economy. It's one of the reasons that we grew really well in the period of shared prosperity between World War II and 1980. But the interesting thing is that in the period since 1980, while we've been growing apart, the only part of our society that's really growing is at the very top. On average, even on average, our growth has slowed down.
So this is bad for everyone.
This is bad
even
for
the folks at the top.
Even the folks at the top, I believe, would have done better if they had sort of gone along with the social compact that said, you know, we really ought to have shared prosperity. We ought to really be working to recreate that middle-class America.
So there's a self-destructive kind of thing happening at the very top.
Yes, and one way, obvious way of seeing that is that you can't have a dynamic economy if people aren't buying goods.
Right.
You can't have people buying goods if they have no income. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
With all the income going to the top, the people in the top save a lot of their income. We used to call that the paradox of thrift. But it's worse than that. They buy a lot of luxury goods that are made abroad. They buy a lot of vacations, taking them abroad. It doesn't recycle into jobs in America.
A final question, Joe. We hear a lot of discussion in the political arena, different plans to address inequality, maybe raise the minimum wage a little bit over here, maybe tax a little bit over there. But I think there's some concern that these plans don't really add up to what's really needed. Is it time to get radical?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think we have to understand that inequality has reached the stage where mild tweaking of the system is not going to work. And when I say inequality, we're talking about inequality of outcomes, incomes, opportunity, health, everything. That it's now become systemic in nature, and you're not going to really attack something that is systemic as our inequality today, something as deep as our inequality today, and something that's built up over now almost a half century, unless you go deeper, unless you attack the underlying forces. And to me, the underlying forces have to do with, as I said, the rules of the game, the way our system operates, what some people would call, political scientists would say, the power structures, the weakening of unions, the weakening, and the strengthening of allowing the CEOs to basically set their own salary, and then they set their own salary and they say, sorry guys, we have to lower your wage because there's no money left. We don't have any money in investment, so there's no job growth in the United States. That situation, which is short-sighted, self-destructive, but reflects a new short-sightedness that's been evident in America, is not good for our country in the long run.
Well, thank you very much. You heard it here first. Time to get radical and take on the power structures with Joe Stiglitz. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate speaking with you, and we'll be catching up with you again soon, no doubt.
Thank you.